everyone for dialing in and sticking around for our closing session of the day. We're very, very excited about this keynote and Q&A with Felicia Pullam, the Executive Director at the Office of Trade Relations for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. We're going to get started here in just a couple of moments. I know we have folks still jumping in from the waiting room, but really looking forward to this session. And Felicia, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks. So are we holding for a few minutes or should we get? Yeah.
Let's go ahead and get started. What I'm going to do here is Felicia has some prepared remarks that we'll kick things off with, and then we're going to transition into a moderated Q&A. So Felicia, while you're speaking, I'm just going to mute my camera and let you take it away.
Okay, sounds good. I was just moving my stapler and other things on the desk, so it looked nice for everybody. But thank you so much for inviting me to participate here today, and thanks also to Lexi for the work coordinating. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone here who's joined us online. I'm sure I can't see who's online, but I know that many of you have engaged with U.S. Customs and Border Protection or CBP in the past. For those of you who are repeat engagers, we really appreciate the time that you're putting into this, as well as your questions and your feedback. And then for anyone on the line who is newly engaging with this issue, really thanks for being here and thank you for your interest. I think my key message is really, this is hard and there's no perfect solution to supply chain tracing and preventing forced labor, but please don't get intimidated. We are making progress and we're thankful that you're involved. So speaking of progress, I just want to kind of take a few minutes to look back so that I can share my optimism. Because I know a lot of times when people engage with CBP, there is fear, there's nervousness and discomfort. And I think we have a lot to be optimistic about. So I moved to China after college a little over 24 years ago. And then a couple years in, I started working for an American consultancy focused on corporate social responsibility and sustainability issues. And I was based in Beijing. And it was an awesome time. There was a lot of interest, there was a lot of optimism, and there was a lot of talk. What is CSR? What does it mean? How do we have sustainable operations? As of the early 2000s, the highest profile brands had already been under a microscope for labor issues overseas for several years. Brands were starting to do China-specific sustainability reporting, but supply chain tracing was stuck around the first or second tier. No one had the market power to go further. Even the biggest companies just could not get down through the supply chain. And I don't think there was anybody who was talking about effectively tracing all the way through to the raw materials. Around 2007 or 2008, an executive from a multinational human resources company visited Hong Kong to give a presentation on forced labor to the international business community. So I was at the time volunteering with the American Chamber of Commerce there on sustainability issues. And we were working hard to try to get companies to show up and participate in that event. His core message was really unforgettable. It was that forced labor is in all of our supply chains or all of these multinational supply chains. And he was on a worldwide tour to talk about what his company had found in their own operations. And it was really eye-opening to hear about what they had experienced as a company. But this was a tough issue. There were, I think, the response was muted at best, and people were quietly saying, what can we do about this? It's too deep. We can't find where it is in our supply chain. We don't have the power to dig that far, and no one company can make a difference. And there aren't enough companies interested. It was also politically untouchable in a lot of countries. So fast forward to June 21st, 2022, the day that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, went into effect. I believe this was a watershed day for the effort to end forced labor. It's the day that the United States began using all of our market power to drive transparency in global supply chains. We had made strides on this through the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, with implementation in 2016 of other forced labor restrictions. But the UFLPA was really such a visible sign. And with all that, it still may not be enough market power, which is why we continue to talk to, our counterparts in other countries. But it's still a heck of a big start. So coincidentally, that was also the day that I started at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I sort of dove into meeting with companies, and I was not terribly surprised to see that after 2 decades, supply chain tracing had not advanced much, or not advanced 20 years worth of advance, given how much technology and how much other things have continued to advance, globally. There were a lot more brands involved, but we're still talking about how do you get past the second or third tier in the supply chain. There's a lot of fear over our enforcement. What was going to happen? Would CBP shut down all trade? What would the result of this really be? And unfortunately, we didn't shut down trade, and we have seen companies successfully comply. So that's a reason that I continue to be very optimistic about this effort. So since the UFLPA became law, we've collectively devoted hundreds of hours to engaging with the trade community, because part of our job is to promote informed compliance. In other words, we want businesses to successfully comply. On the communications front, I do have some good news to share. We have launched a revamp of our forced labor website earlier this month. And so we hope that will be easier to navigate and find guidance materials to help you. And our team has been working steadily throughout the past fiscal year to provide additional guidance and transparency. Earlier in the year, we updated best practices for submitting documentation, as well as updated our sample table of contents. We also published a Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act attachment to the Notice of a Detention, or Addendum Attachment 2-B. This Attachment 2B is an effort to provide importers with examples and best practices from former reviews that may be helpful in providing supply chain documentation when requesting an applicability review. We've created some explainer videos, and we do plan to release more. And most importantly, CBP is also continuing to develop a new centralized portal to submit forced labor allegations, requests for withhold, release, order, WRO, and finding modifications, UFLPA exception reviews, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act exception reviews, UFLPA applicability reviews, and WRO admissibility reviews. So that's a lot. That was quite a mouthful. But the bottom line is we hope this will be more convenient to public entities, companies, advocates, others who are connecting with us. We hope that this will increase the convenience and keep things, centralized for you. We also hope it will increase CBP's visibility and our ability, across the agency to support these supply chain reviews, increase the uniformity of our decision making, and provide more internal accountability and oversight in the process. So that's something that I think we're really looking forward to and excited about. But I'm sure, as many of you know, importers are still facing challenges. So I'd like to touch on a few of those. First, it's important to acknowledge that our enforcement has not been perfect. We continue to build the plane as we fly it. We continue to take feedback and to try to improve our own operations. So we still welcome feedback for how we can improve. In an ideal world, we would also be able to tell companies exactly what they need to do to comply. And I know that there is a hunger for that has continued. But we can't, we are trying to be as straightforward as we possibly can, because every supply chain is different. And, documentation that could work for one supply chain may not exist in other countries for another supply chain. So we are, however, still seeing some basic issues when companies present documentation for applicability reviews. And we don't want anybody to be caught up because of things that could be easily rectified. And so I know my colleagues wanted me to share a few examples of best practices. So first, please provide English translations for documents and organize them in a way that makes it easier for someone who is not familiar with your supply chain to understand. You could include an executive summary with something like an annotated document list that numbers the documents. So like an index, basically, listing each document as well as explaining the purpose or significance kind of briefly, why that document is there. You could include within the summary information that kind of connects each step in the transportation and manufacturing processes so that our teams can kind of see how it flows and why things are kind of logically connected together, and any other context that would make that information easier to follow for someone, again, who is not an expert in your supply chain. So these tips are online in the guidance that I mentioned earlier. And so if you aren't familiar with those documents, I hope you'll take a look. We've also been asked many times about technology, and that is a challenge that companies are facing because that's a big investment. Companies want to know like where they should invest their resources to be most effective. So they ask us what technology we recommend or what technology we will accept. These are fair questions, but not ones that we really can answer. As I'm sure many of you know, there are pros and cons for all of the technologies that are out there, and they continue to evolve. So nothing's a perfect silver bullet. Many companies and organizations are working very hard to find technological solutions. And we are in a position to recommend one technology provider over another. And we also use technology in different ways than industry does. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. It's also worth mentioning another pervasive issue that affects importers as well as CBP. And that's the bifurcation of supply chains. So that essentially means you have companies that might be producing and have one supply chain that is for the United States, that's like dedicated that these materials go to the United States. Whereas they may have another supply chain that's maybe still under the same management, the same facility or whatever, that includes UFLPA violative materials or materials that would be violative if it was coming to the US, but it's destined for other countries. And so that existence of a bifurcation in itself is a risk that's not easy to manage. So that's something that many companies are really looking at and struggling with. How do you manage that? So at CBP, we do understand how challenging this is. We really sincerely do, and we appreciate it and have empathy. After all, we have our people pouring through this documentation, and as they're looking at it, I mean, they really do understand what it can take to deliver that documentation. Of course, we have kind of a mixture of some cynicism, and you can't work at a law enforcement agency and not be a little skeptical, because I think that is literally part of our job. But we also try to temper that with optimism about the results and the importance of this effort. We have consistently heard how difficult it is to trace supply chains back to the raw material. And I know I heard the word impossible many times when back in 2022. We've told and seen with our own eyes how enormously complex and variable these supply chains can be, even within individual companies and within individual shipments. And we understand that companies don't have the market power necessarily with their suppliers, or the computing capacity in some cases, and the resources to do that. But at the same time, we have also heard companies say, you've reviewed the supply chain already, and we have successfully documented it, So why are you stopping more shipments? It's the same supply chain. So there's truth in both of these. There's the truth in the complexity and in the fact that companies have successfully been able to document supply chains. And so that, like I said, it shows how complex this is, but I think also shows that companies have been able to do it. And that's something to be happy about. Um, but I think for CBP, the bottom line is that importers need to know their supply chains and they need to be able to document those supply chains in a way that law enforcement auditors can read, understand, and take as credible. The good news, as I said, is that we're seeing some companies be successful in this. And I believe, American industry has led the way to design incredible, innovative products with supply chains that are truly masterpieces in complexity as well as in quality. So was it by design, was it by engineering, or was it organic growth as supply chains have evolved over the decades? Or was it a combination of all of that? Regardless, there's an incredible amount of expertise and ingenuity within industry, and you each have a far better understanding of your own operations than we do. So I believe that industry is capable of designing ways to successfully trace and manage these supply chains already and moving forward. This is incredibly important. As I'm sure all of you know, slavery is abhorrent and shameful. No one here wants the fruit of your labor, your creativity, your passion, and your livelihoods to be tainted by the forced labor of others. And so I look forward to further conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Marissa.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Really, really helpful insights for our audience, and such a great sort of look back at what's led us to this point in 2024. And I think we're all looking forward to some of the really exciting changes and updates that you mentioned as we head into 2025. On that note, I'd like to sort of drill down on some recent news that I'm sure our audience would love to hear more about. The Biden administration had recently announced efforts to crack down on the so-called de minimis loophole. This is something that companies have been talking about for a while, that regulators have been talking about for a while. How do you see this impacting forced labor enforcement moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think when people bring up de minimis, I have like a tendency to go on ad nauseum, not to throw around too many Latin terms there, but I'm excited about the prospects for de minimis reform. As you mentioned, the administration announced some actions that we are taking, including some regulatory actions. So that there was one. So three, I'll go through those in a second, but three key regulatory actions, as well as some legislative proposals. And of course, with the legislative proposals, we defer to Congress and are really excited about the interest we've had there. With the regulatory issues, so I'll talk about the first one, which is something that has been led by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or CPSC, and that's meant to require certification when products are imported to be submitted electronically. And that really will enable us to better collect those certificates for de minimis products that are coming in. And so that's a great piece of news for consumer safety, whether we're talking about toys that might have lead paint or other types of goods. So that's great news. Having that documentation, I think, will be also helpful as we're considering where to prioritize our efforts for enforcement. And so then the other two pieces, I think, are a little bit more directly related to forced labor enforcement. And the first one is the entry of low value shipments. And so this regulatory, sorry, that was my little alarm that I have set. So this is something that we've been working on for a few years. And the key is that we do need more information on these shipments as they're coming through. And the more information we have, the better we'll be able to target shipments for a whole variety of things, including forced labor. And then the second piece is excluding goods that are subject to Section 301, Section 201, Section 232 trade remedies from using de minimis. So that will, what we hope that will reduce the volume of de minimis, which again will help us better focus our efforts. That would also cover a lot of goods like apparel goods that might be at higher risk because of the cotton elements. And so it'll kind of enable us to focus more because the volume we hope will be reduced. And then we'll be getting more information as those goods come in through other means.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm really interested to see how this proceeds forward. I know that there's been, a lot of momentum around closing this loophole. And it really significantly, were this to happen, this really significantly uh, um, expands the ability to address forced labor, products made with forced labor from entering the U.S. So really interested to see how that shakes out. So, over the course of this year, the DHS has expanded its list of high priority sectors. Some industries have not faced a high number of detentions under the UFLPA, and something that we've seen at Sourcemap and from amongst some of our colleagues as well, is that some of those industries may have a tendency to sit back and wait until enforcement agents look in their direction, whether that is through entities from their industry or sector getting added to the official entities list, or any sort of regulatory action that seems to focus on their respective industries. Do you have any advice or best practices, or frankly, even warnings to industries that have adopted this approach where they are sort of waiting to see if the eyes of competent authorities are looking in their direction versus adopting a proactive approach?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I know when I first started, so again, with CBP was mid 2022, we had a lot of people asking, like, can you please give us 6 months notice? Is there some way you can give us 6 months notice when you're going to start targeting in a certain area? And and we can't, but in some way, I mean, obviously we already have because, with in 2016, when TIFTIA went into effect, that was already kind of first forced labor, kind of raising awareness of that. And then when the UFLPA was passed, I mean, that was a big warning to start looking at your supply chain and to start getting ready. And so I continued getting that question up through 2023, and my response was like, you've had it. You've had more than 6 months now. And I understand, I mean, especially if you're dealing with very complex products with a lot of different inputs, you have to prioritize your resources and really balance your risk and figure out where you can be most effective to make sure that you don't have forced labor. But you can't wait until we detain your goods because by then it's just going to be too late. And if you haven't had a plan already for how you would react to a detention, if you wait until it's detained, at the very beginning, we were giving many extensions. And so it's because some people would blame us and say like, oh, these things have been detained for like, a crazy amount of time. But it's also because we were also often giving extensions to the companies who weren't able to produce that documentation because it's such a hard thing to figure out. And so, you really need to figure out what is your game plan for getting that documentation together and to make sure you're able to do it before we issue a detention.
Thank you so much for that. A follow-up question, sort of in a similar vein. I'm sure you've gotten this question many, many times, but do you have any insights on where DHS plans to focus next in terms of high priority sectors as we head into 2025?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, we did, DHS recently released an update to the strategy, which kind of outlines key sectors And that's really kind of, where DHS is looking for the entity list, because they also have to kind of prioritize their resources and figure out where they can have the biggest impact with the entity list. And it's also, helping us focus educational resources and raising awareness in those industries. From the CBP perspective, for our targeting, we can target across the tariff schedule. So we're really kind of looking at what information we have, what intelligence is coming in, and where we're seeing those red flags that pop up. And it may not be in some of these priority industries. In fact, it often isn't in one of these priority industries. So as we're moving into fiscal year 2025, we're working to continue broadening our targeting and screening across the tariff schedule, both in traditional cargo and other high risk environments like de minimis.
Thank you for that. I know we're approaching time here. I have a couple of quick questions, rapid fire questions I want to ask you to close things up. So you mentioned during your remarks that CBP is open to feedback from industry. Do you have a recommendation on how companies can provide that feedback and sort of where to go to do so?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, you're always welcome to kind of find me. If you don't have my email, we can share it, or you can find it on LinkedIn. I'm actually just looking over at our website, and I know that there should be a mechanism on our website to also share feedback. And I think we would be happy to take that either way. There it is, UFLPA inquiry at cbp.dhs.gov. So that's kind of the official formal email address.
Excellent. And a similar question, just a quick question from the audience. The documents you mentioned around guidance, the importer guidance, where can our attendees find those documents?
That's a great question. So if you go on, again, I'm kind of looking over at the screen. We have our forced labor website. So if you just go on to the CBP homepage, you can find that under the trade column. There should be a forced labor key trade issue, forced labor. And that's our general forced labor website. So there are materials on that, and you'll see materials kind of covering partnerships and policy and guidance for industry and whatnot. And so you can, if you go into the guidance for industry section, there are a lot of materials on that page itself. And these are kind of related to all forced labor. We have an FAQ at the bottom, and we have some videos at the bottom there too. But we also have a section there that's called, it just says Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA. And that kind of box has another box that you can hopefully see quickly that says learn about CBP enforcement of UFLPA. And if you click on that, then you'll find these resources, including our operational guidance, more FAQs that are specifically related to UFLPA, as well as best practices and guidance and samples for the UFLPA applicability review. And then the detention document I mentioned has its own box. So you can find that way.
Thank you so much. I want to say to our audience, if you do have those questions or on best practices, really do peruse some of the resources that Felicia just provided. There really are so many resources on CBP's website, those FAQs, the importer guidance, of course, but a lot of answers to some of the common questions that I'm sure you and your colleagues get. A lot of those answers are in those resources that are published on CBP's website. So for our audience members, please take a look at those resources, and hopefully you can find some of the answers that you're looking for. Felicia, I want to thank you so much for participating in this this panel. Really some excellent insights and a lot for us to look forward to as we head into 2025. This has been such an interesting year for CBP, for DHS, for FLETF, really for anyone who is focused on forced labor enforcement in the U.S. A lot has happened this year, And as we've discussed throughout this panel, there's a lot happening as we head into the end of the year and head into 2025. So thank you again for your time this afternoon, and we really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it too.